Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the President's Day Festival and at our Town Hall Press Conference. I'm Kennedy Library Forum producer Liz Murphy, and I am delighted to welcome our special guests for today's press conference. Second President John Adams is kindly here with us today, as well as First Lady Abigail Adams. I'm also delighted to introduce our third president, Thomas Jefferson, as well as our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. We are all looking forward to your questions today. If you're joining us here in person, please feel free to come up to the microphones in the aisles here in the theater to ask your questions. If you're joining us online, please email your questions to jfkpresidentsday@nara.gov, NARA.gov, and we'll make sure to get your questions asked, as many as we can, during this time here for our press conference. And now, I'm absolutely delighted to kick off the conference. If anyone has any early questions, please do come up to the mics. Perhaps as we're waiting for our first question or two, would any of our distinguished guests today have any quick words of wisdom they'd like to share with our guests?
Well, as I said in my inauguration, our country needs to stay out of foreign politics and wars, most specifically Great Britain and France. We need to guard against fractions from party politics, and I would also worry about that which is written in the press, journalism, and fairness. Those would be my three thoughts for my inauguration.
So does that mean no questions that are political or foreign or
Well,
newsworthy?
just truth-based, sir. Truth-based.
That opens it up for all of you.
If we're distilling our thoughts into one small maxim at a time, I might go a bit more broad than my husband and just repeat one of my favorite sayings, is to be good and do good is the whole duty of mankind, comprised in a few words.
I certainly appreciate that maxim, Mrs. Adams, as I appreciate this opportunity to be in the company of my friends, Mr. and Mrs. Adams. To remind you all, as I've been able to make my way northwards here to Boston once again, because I was here only one time before, hoping to have sailed to France with Mrs. Adams, but she had already set sail by the time I arrived. But it delights me to know that I can be in the company, particularly when you realize that both the North and the South in our colonies came together with this particular document, which I think all of you know was written not only by myself, I wrote the first draft, but also Mr. Adams was on the committee of 5 men who helped to write this. And as I met Mr. Lincoln for the first time here today, as we had a wonderful conversation, he was able to inform me that what will take you a good 20 minutes to read, he was able to write a speech that only took him 2 minutes to sum it all up. What did you call it? What did you call that speech you told me you gave that sums this up in 2 minutes?
I don't know. This man just gave this to me, and I'm completely confused as to what I'm to do with it. You said I was to speak? Oh, yes, nonetheless. I guess they didn't have these in your time.
No.
So tell me your question again.
Well, I was saying that as I met Mr. Lincoln, that you were telling me that you summed up all of the principles in our Declaration of American Independence in a speech that you delivered for only 2 minutes.
Well, that is true, and I was asked. It was a rather solemn occasion because you mentioned the North and the South came together to agree upon this document, and I'm afraid that they didn't exactly stay together on the principles of that document, and so we ended up with a war over slavery, which, as you and many others feared, would ultimately come. And in one of the more signal battles I was asked as a secondary thought, being president, they thought it was appropriate that I should come and make a few remarks. So I knew I didn't have much time in which to make my remarks, so I tried to sum things up. And it was in a little place called Gettysburg. The main speaker who gave the Gettysburg Address, Edward Everett, was the one that everyone was interested in. But he was kind enough to include my brief remarks in his book that he had published about the event.
Well, there you are.
So they call his address the Gettysburg Address, and in the back of the book, the president's remarks, if you look it up in the book, you'll find my remarks there.
Does that mean presidents will be more concise in the future and say less?
Well, I have known men that amazed me at how few thoughts they could, how many words they could use to express a few thoughts, and I've always thought it better to do the opposite.
We're all familiar with that
Indeed.
tendency of men in office.
In
Far too many words to express far too few thoughts.
Thank you
I
all
did
for
write
sharing
to
your
the
thoughts.
Congress.
I just wanted to make sure to invite anyone in the room who has a question. Please do come to the mics in the aisles here in the audience as you are moved, as you have questions to ask. I have, through a new technological medium that some of our guests may be less familiar with, I do have a question from a member of our online audience who is asking, this is for all of our guests today, were there those in or out of government who wanted to destroy it? If there were, how were they treated in your time?
Oh dear. Should I just speak for all of us, or does everyone else have something to say as well?
Well, we've had more than one war, so why don't you speak to yours and I can speak to mine.
So,
Keep in mind to keep it concise, Mr. Adams.
thank you, my dear. Yes, well, I think we've already mentioned his name, have we not, in our talk earlier. As far as I am concerned, in my administration, the great destroyer of government was retired Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. The men of my cabinet, the Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, James McHenry, the Secretary of War, and certainly the Secretary of the Treasury, his understudy, Oliver Wolcott Jr., all took orders directly from him before even speaking to me. When we were raising an army to defend this country against the French, a war, thankfully, that never came, he wanted a large army. We only gave him 10,000 men, even though it was originally to be 25,000. And Mr. Hamilton sent a letter regarding President Washington in retirement to be commander, although we all know who would be commander in the field, do we not? That a letter I was not to see, that Mr. McHenry was to deliver to President Washington at Mount Vernon, and to take no heed of anything that I should say. That is certainly subversion in time of war, is it not? There was a great threat of war with France. So that would be my answer to that question.
I'll have to agree with my husband that if you had to put one person in mind who might be damaging the young government and the future of the nation, it would be the Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Not only for his intrigue with John's cabinet, but also the French Revolution. I have a great fear that the excesses of the French Revolution are taking a strong hold in the United States. And for him to... I fear that there are spies who are working their way into the minds of those who are in power, and I personally will have none of it. I'll speak against it as long as I can, but I'll yield the rest of my time to Mr. Jefferson.
Well, I certainly am familiar how both you, Mrs. Adams, and Mr. Adams had your personal opinions about General Alexander Hamilton. And I am certain that you will be reading these in your time, Mr. Lincoln. But I would say that no one perhaps worked with him more closely in a difference of opinion within our government than myself. And remember, when many people come to visit Monticello, as they walk into the entrance hall, they're rather startled to see an overly large bust of me on the right-hand side. That would be your right-hand side. I'm not very favorable to it. And then they look to the left and they see a very finely carved bust of General Alexander Hamilton. And they stand there struck. If I'm present, I'll say yes. There the two of us will gaze across at one and the other in opposition throughout death as we have been in life. The reason? Never forget this. That is what we can do in our nation. That you cannot do so freely as we have all known it under a monarchy, under any totalitarian or authoritarian government. We, the people, can argue and debate our differences of opinion. And therefore, General Hamilton and I well understood, as I wrote in my first inaugural address, as Americans, a difference of opinion must never be a difference of principle. We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. Those were the political platforms you may have heard the Adams speak about early on today. Now, General Hamilton and I, you may recall, Mr. and Mrs. Adams, we collaborated with one and the other, and we compromised more than we ever differed in our extensive opinions. We saved our nation when the government was in New York that June 1790. The arguments over the Assumption Bill, the arguments over the Residency Act. It was Mr. Madison that we had to convince. He was still undecided. So we met in my dining room, there in my chambers, 57 Maiden Lane, and we compromised. So I mentioned that the other day, and the young boy said, Mr. Jefferson, was that the room where it happened? Yes, I think that's a good term for it. And then remember, General Hamilton and I compromised on our Coast Guard. He called it the necessity of militia boats. I called it the necessity of revenue cutters and militia boats. We both formed the Coast Guard. We both compromised and stabilized the currency of our nation, the same value of money in all of our states and commonwealths. He allowed me to create the decimal system. And furthermore than that, I did not believe in his plan for a standing army in times of peace. I thought that would be a drain on our treasury. But I decided I would compromise, but so did he. If we were going to have a standing army, then let it be led by a well-educated officer corps. So I welcome a standing army in times of peace, and he was able to live and see me as president found West Point. I founded West Point, 1802, our military academy and the first school of engineering. So I hope we never forget, yes, we have differences of opinions, but as Americans, let it never be a difference of principle.
Well, I am not certain how to be brief because the period in which I was in the executive office was so tumultuous, and the questions that came up regarding enemies were not easily solved. For instance, we treasure the right to freedom of speech. I don't know if this is of any use. Apparently now it is of use. But does freedom of speech mean that in time of war we may aid and abet our enemies? We had some when the war of secession devolved upon us. I should tell you that the great question that came upon us was regarding slavery, and southern states concluded that the Constitution admitted of secession. I disagreed and stood upon that disagreement, and from that we had the result of war. And so we were divided, and they began firing upon our military establishments, and without going into much further detail, that was the basis of the war. But the constitutional rights, such as freedom of speech, then became an issue. Does that mean that we can say anything at any time? Freedom of the press is another. And some who disagreed with me began to be aiders and abettors of our enemies. And I was put into a very difficult position. Should they be reprimanded? Should they be jailed? Should they be silenced? Should they be allowed to remain aiding and abetting our enemies? I tried all of those and ended up believing that it would do more damage to stop the freedom of the press and jail the editors that were encouraging the secessionists and so forth, as well as private citizens. There was a gentleman who had been in the United States House named Clement Vallandigham out in Ohio that was encouraging young men to join the opposition. And it was, again, a question of how far do our liberties take us, and where are the limits in time of war? We ended up with prisoner of war camps on both sides, to get back to the original question. And to our shame, many of the prisoners were ill-treated. War brings out terrible things in us. We don't want war. And what I discovered is that many during this particular war took up old grievances that had nothing to do with the fundamental premises of secession and slavery, and used the war as an excuse to bring vindictiveness and punishment upon their neighbors for old grievances that had nothing to do with the war. And so it seemed like every foul bird and every slimy reptile came out from under the rocks and began to air their grievances during these days. And so it's a very difficult question. And some of those hatreds and grievances came out in the prison camps and were perpetrated upon the prisoners, and some of the prisoners were starved purposely on both sides.
Thank you for all of your thought-provoking comments on that question. And next question.
Hello, President and First Lady. I have two questions today for President Adams and President Lincoln. My question for President Adams is, you said in your segment with First Lady Abigail that when we were writing our Constitution, that the job of the president was mostly written for George Washington. With that information, why did you still run for president even though you were going to lose?
Well, this is to be a republic. Excellent question. I felt that I must run because of all I had done in Europe, that if we are going to be a republic, we are going to hold elections. Just because the Constitution was written with His Excellency in mind does not mean that no one else should run. There should be competition, as both of these presidents and my dear wife have said, that there must be an exchange of ideas. There can be differences of opinion. And as I wrote in the Massachusetts Constitution in 1779, ratified in 1780, that there should be freedom of the press. There should be freedom of speech, although it would be removed and returned later in the Constitution, but that is but a quibble. For that very reason, if we are to be a republic and we are going to have three branches of government with an independent executive, none of them should be unmolested in differences of opinion. There should be those who run against another. Now, the fact that we evolved into a two-party system concerns me a great deal, and it is what I had to deal with the most during my time as president, as well as the half-war with France. There must be more than one candidate, so that there may be an exchange of ideas, and so that one opinion does not get expressed so much that it is the only opinion in the room. And I believe, Mr. Jefferson, you would be in agreement with that as well, and certainly Mrs. Adams, and our young friend down there who would be president after our time as well. There must be freedom of expression, and that includes freedom of opinion, freedom to run for office.
President Lincoln, in 1858, you had many debates with Stephen A. Douglas for the senator spot in Illinois. Even though you lost that election, you would bring up great points like a house divided cannot stand. Why do you think you lost that election, but were still able to win the 1860 election for president?
Well, that's an excellent question. The principles which came out in those debates, I believe, continue on today. The premise upon a house divided did not originate with me. And the election to the presidency, I think what happened in the debates, even though I lost, I actually did get the majority, but because we were running for a senatorial seat representing the state of Illinois, not the people. Our government is set up so that the people are represented in the United States House, but the states are represented in the United States Senate. And because of that, the Constitution wisely provided that the final word for the senatorial candidate from Illinois to go to the United States Senate should be decided by the Illinois State House. They knew the issues at hand better than the people who had come to the debates. And so they, even though I had the majority, they chose Mr. Douglas. That's another issue, and I accepted that. But what happened then, 2 years later in the presidential election, was largely due to what happened in the Chicago Convention. I had campaigned to be everybody's favorite second choice. I didn't do much campaigning personally. Mr. Douglas did a lot of that, but I let others speak for me. And so because there was intense competition between the various states in selecting the candidate for the Republican race that was coming, they couldn't agree upon a first choice, but they could agree upon a second choice, and I was the one. So it wasn't directly related to the issues in the debate, the fact that I was selected in the Chicago Convention to run for the presidency. My victory in that, again, was something not even secondary, but tertiary, because the Democrats had split into 3 candidates. I only garnered a little more than 40% of the national vote. And fortunately, we have an electoral college system, but because the Democrats had split 3 ways, their 60% had to be divided up amongst them, and no one was able to match what I had, and I was elected. So, does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah. I tried my best.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next question?
Back to Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Didn't Alexander Hamilton help you get to that point?
Did Alexander Hamilton, I beg your pardon, I could not hear clearly.
Didn't Alexander Hamilton help you get to that point?
To the point, of the presidency? Well, now I think you know better why the Adams do not have a high opinion of General Hamilton. Although I will tell you, dear, yes, you're absolutely correct. But it was not because of any interference with Mr. Adams, let alone his lovely lady. No, the interference was actually between, well, there were 4 candidates who were standing for the office of president in 1800. Now, some say 2 were vice presidential candidates. There was no such thing, because remember, the Constitution was originally written, whoever receives the second highest number of votes then becomes vice president. Mr. Lincoln, can you imagine anything more ridiculous in our Constitution at the very beginning? And we would change it. Happily, the Constitution is open to amendment, but that would not be for another 4 years. And that is the reason why, when I stood for president in 1796, in opposition to Mr. Adams, I lost and became his vice president for 4 years. And I certainly was not a silent vice president, was I, Mr. Adams? I'd let my opinions be known. But the point is, 4 were contending. Our platforms were split. Mr. Adams' platform was split by a Southern Federalist from South Carolina, General Charles Colesworth Pinckney, and my platform, the Anti-Federalist, were split by a Northern Federalist. He saw a political opportunity. He changed his code. He became a renegade. He split his party. Do you know who I'm referring to? Oh, I'm glad he's forgotten. You don't have to say his name so loud. We don't need to hear it so loudly. Yes, Aaron Burr.
Must be.
And so when the election finally came to the vote, though I received the popular vote, I wish we could stop right there, but we had to handle it in the Electoral College. Mr. Adams was not even in the high number of votes. It was a, well, you were not in the high number of votes. It was a tie between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, 73 electoral votes each. So, our Constitution is ready for that. If it ever happens, the election continues and it goes where? Into the House. Never ever forget that. Someone the other day said, oh, Mr. Jefferson, it goes to the Supreme Court. Have you ever heard anything more ridiculous than that? No, it goes to that body elected by the people. And so it caucused in the House, and we had to vote to break the 73 electoral votes each. And we voted, 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 and we voted. Don't think this is an element of whimsy. We voted, someone told me the other day, the House voted what, 11, 12 times? We voted 33 times without breaking that tie. And then we began to worry. Where do we go from here? And some gentlemen may understand 33 is a significant number. What further work is necessary? What other tools must we utilize to reconcile this, to improve the nature of man as best we can, polish off that rough stone? And you are correct, dear. I received a letter from Alexander Hamilton. I'll never forget the first sentence. Dear Mr. Vice President, I consider you the least dangerous of the 2 candidates. That's what he wrote me. And he offered a compromise. Well, of course, how did we bring 13 individual nations together? E pluribus unum, compromise. That's how we did it. That's the founding principle of our nation. And so he suggested that if he could break that tie and I become the 3rd president, that after my inauguration, I would not cast out of office all Federalists. I would not get rid of anyone with a different political opinion from me, because that is what makes our nation. So many different opinions, as you've heard here from all of us. And so I accepted that compromise, and yes, it was General Hamilton who, more than anyone else, helped me be elected the president. Very good.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Would
Thank
you
you.
have done the same for me?
Thank you, and I hate to note that our time is drawing short. We have enough time for 2 or 3 questions, and we have a few good ones from our online viewers, but I know that first we have someone who's been waiting very patiently in the room. Next question, please.
When you were president, did you always live in the White House, or did you live somewhere else for a while?
An excellent question. Mrs. Adams.
Any of these working. I'll speak loudly. While I never was president myself, Now is this?
Good
There's some
gracious.
sort of foolery going on. All right. The presidential mansion, Mr. Adams and I were the first inhabitants of it, though it was barely inhabitable. It was right at the tail end of Mr. Adams's presidency. In fact, the last few months of it, we spent the last winter that John was president in the presidential mansion, which at the time was not known as the White House, but would eventually become so, and it was only half done. There was plaster drying on the walls. The fires had to be kept running constantly so the plaster would dry in time, which left a smoky residue around the entire house. I would leave our laundry to dry in one of the greater rooms. The main staircase was not yet functional. You had to use a back staircase to go up and down between the floors. I should hope very much that further inhabitants of the presidential manor would have an easier go of the circumstances there.
As a matter of fact, yes, I lived in the president's house, as we called it, for 8 years, 2 terms, and we did complete that grand staircase to make it more amenable for people going above stairs. We called it the president's house. It had a very sheer white wash to it, but I've never known it referred to as the White House. How about you, Mr. Lincoln?
Well, we did hear references often to it as the White House. It was also called the Executive Mansion, and it was a place that I happily left in the summer. The Anacostia Canal, which was supposed to go all the way to the west, it was a wonderful idea that never happened, was filled with dead animals and all sorts of rubbish, and it made the place everyone was sick. So in the summer, Mrs. Lincoln and I went out to the soldiers' home and rented a cottage there and did most of our business of living in the soldiers' home cottages. And I would ride back and forth to take care of official business in the White House, as it was now being called.
Mosquitoes and tree stumps outside when we were there. Not a pleasant place.
Thank you. And I believe we have time for one more quick last question. We will have an opportunity for more questions, including the questions from our online viewers during our second Town Hall press conference at 1:10. But for now, our final question.
I have a question for Thomas Jefferson. In the Declaration, I'm not sure if it's the Declaration or the Constitution, you say that all men are created equal, yet you still own slaves and your own college was built by slave labor. What do you have to say about that?
I am delighted to hear you make this question so pointed, particularly to me, because in my opinion, you represent exactly what an American citizen ought to represent. And being so bold to ask these questions, to confront these questions directly, that is who we are. And that is the only way that we can ever rectify and compromise and settle what makes us fall beneath the ideals of our nation, which are expressed in our Declaration of American Independence. First and foremost, and I make no excuses, yes, all men are created equal. Now, ladies, mind you, men is capitalized. That means mankind. Now, are we all created equal in face and form? No, it's to your great advantage, sir. You look far different than I do. Are we all created equal in mental capacity? No. Some of us are minds more acute, others we have to take our time. But are we not all created equal, that is, in nature? Are we not all born free? As the flora and fauna, yes, those are the laws of nature, nature's God. But what our Declaration represents in its second part, and I will speak about that later, is the fact that though we are all born free in nature, we are born into the laws of man. There's the contradiction. That is why our nation has been founded, to do something about that, to rectify that. And so I ask you, is it going to happen overnight? You know it will not. It takes a great deal of time. And remember, the enslaving of our fellow man was engaged by whom when we were colonies? Great Britain, the Royal Africa Company, And that was not overnight either. That was for generations and centuries. As Mr. Adams has written, as I have written, as many of us wrote, before the American Revolution, there was nothing we could do about the enslaving of our fellow man. And we tried through petitions and prohibitions and duties, which might amount to a prohibition. So therefore, again, I make no excuses. We continue on in this abominable institution, but happily no longer in all of those former colonies, no longer in all of the territories that are becoming new states in our nation. I hope that as we move forward into the future, laws can be made that will end this for every state in our union. I hope.
Thank you so much, and I'm so sorry we're out of time for this session. Thanks to all of you for the great questions and for joining us. Please thank me in joining our special guests for this fabulous discussion. President Jefferson will speak at more length in just a few more minutes at approximately 12:30, and then we'll have another press conference at 1:10. Please enjoy the day, and we'll see you again soon.
All right.